Many women, upon reaching a deep level of awareness and self-respect, begin to be labeled by the world around them with a specific word: dangerous. However, according to Jung's psychology, this adjective rarely describes someone who seeks to hurt others, but rather someone who has stopped being manipulable. The danger that others perceive is, in fact, the resilience of a soul that has integrated its shadow and no longer accepts roles of submission. When a woman decides that her peace is worth more than social approval, she accesses a silent force that destabilizes old toxic patterns. This final stage is the birth of an inner sovereignty that imposes clear boundaries without needing to raise one's voice. The transformation occurs when the fear of being judged is replaced by the unwavering clarity of someone who has become master of herself. This journey of reconstruction begins the moment a woman stops projecting her need for validation onto the external world and turns her gaze inward. Jung explained that integrating the shadow allows us to access resources of courage that lay dormant beneath layers of excessive agreeableness and fear of conflict. By embracing her own truth, she ends a cycle of emotional dependence and begins to walk with an authority that many mistake for coldness or arrogance. In reality, she has simply stopped offering unrestricted access to her inner garden, to those who do not know how to honor her presence. The impact of this change is profound, as it removes the power of any pattern of control that previously kept her stagnant and silent. The rebirth of this woman is an invitation for her to occupy her space in the world with dignity and a renewed purpose. The woman called dangerous is one who has learned to read between the lines of human interactions and identify manipulative behaviors before they take root. She no longer gets lost in other people's emotional labyrinths because her internal compass is calibrated with maturity and careful observation of psychic reality. This awakening generates discomfort in emotionally immature people who depend on the vulnerability of others to maintain their own illusion of superiority and dominance. For Jung, this woman has reached the stage of individuation where the ego is no longer the master, but rather the servant of a much greater essence. She exudes a peace that cannot be bought and a firmness that cannot be broken by empty promises or external pressures. Her strength does not reside in aggression, but in the impossibility of being reduced again to a fragment of who she was truly born to be. Often, the label of dangerous is attached to those who have had the audacity to heal their wounds and transform pain into transformative and resilient wisdom. The world feels threatened by women who cannot be bought with praise nor silenced by criticism, for they have found their source of self-worth. They understand that true liberation does not come from an external struggle, but from an internal turning point that reconciles all aspects of themselves, including the most difficult ones. By accepting their complete history, they remove the emotional hooks that kept them trapped in draining relationships and controlling patterns that sapped their vitality. The secret of this new identity is that it doesn't need to prove anything to anyone, making it immune to tactics of psychological manipulation. Emotional sovereignty is the final stage where a woman becomes the architect of her own destiny, guided by the light of consciousness. Reaching this level of self-knowledge requires closing heavy cycles, with a clarity that few are willing to face honestly and deeply. She has learned that self-respect is a daily act of courage and that maintaining boundaries is the highest form of expressing love for herself and others. Her presence in an environment demands that people level up or withdraw, as she no longer maintains masks or tiresome social theatrics. For analytical psychology, this woman is the personification of psychic maturity, someone who has integrated her animus and walks with balance and strength. She does not seek conflict, but her mere existence unmasks the lack of empathy and falsehood around her, which makes her fascinating and intimidating. The danger, therefore, is only for those who cannot bear the light of truth emanating from a heart that has completely healed. In the final stage of transformation, the dangerous woman becomes a living mirror, reflecting the unworked shadows of all who approach her with hidden intentions. Carl Jung described how, when a person becomes conscious, they naturally expose the unconsciousness of others without needing to utter a single word of accusation or judgment. Those who live by appearances feel stripped bare before this woman, for she sees beyond facades and recognizes emotional manipulation in its earliest signs. This gift of clarity is what generates collective fear, for the truth she carries is non-negotiable and acts as a purifying filter. If you feel you are awakening to this inner strength and seek to rebuild your life based on truth, subscribe to the channel to strengthen your journey. This integration requires her to have confronted her own demons and transformed each wound into a stepping stone of awareness and moral and spiritual authority. She does not fear the judgment of others because she has already judged and forgiven herself, finding a point of equilibrium where the world's opinion loses its weight. The narcissism or lack of empathy of others no longer finds fertile ground to grow in the presence of someone so grounded in her own essence. For Jung, this woman is the queen of her own inner world, exercising a rule of justice and compassion over her own thoughts and emotions. She knows that the greatest battle was won in the silence of her soul, where liberation from social expectations finally solidified into peace. The brilliance she emits is not meant to dazzle, but to illuminate the path of those who also seek personal integrity. The stage of the dangerous woman is marked by an elegant detachment from everything superficial, or that demands the sacrifice of her integrity to be maintained. She has learned to say no with a firm sweetness that leaves no room for toxic negotiations or attempts to invade her sacred boundaries. Her energy is no longer wasted on pointless arguments or trying to fix people who do not desire their own change or conscious evolution. By focusing on her reconstruction, she creates a magnetic field of self-respect that naturally repels what is draining and attracts what is nourishing and real. She understands that time is her most precious resource, and that her inner peace is a treasure that must be guarded with loving and constant vigilance. The transformation is visible in her eyes, which now carry the depth of someone who has crossed the emotional desert and found her own oasis. Jung emphasized that the individuation process makes us unique beings, often isolating us from the masses who prefer conformity and blind obedience. The woman who has reached this stage doesn't mind loneliness, for she has discovered that her own company is rich, vast, and full of spiritual meaning. She no longer seeks to be loved at any cost, but prefers to be respected for her authenticity and the clarity of her non-negotiable values. This detachment generates a freedom of action that is terrifying to systems based on control and constant psychological pressure on the individual. She walks through the world like a force of nature, following the laws of her own soul and not the whims of an immature society. The secret of her silent strength is that she doesn't need anyone to validate her existence or her inner and outer beauty. By embracing her complete nature, she ceases to be a victim of circumstances and assumes the role of architect of her own psychic and material reality. The toxic experiences of the past have become the fertilizer for the growth of a wisdom that now serves as a shield and guide for her present decisions. She holds no grudges, for she understands that resentment is a shackle that would bind her to the past, preventing her continuous and vibrant rebirth. The dangerous woman is, in essence, the healed woman, the one who no longer allows the noise of the world to silence the voice of her own intuition. Her dangerousness lies in the fact that she is the master of her own mind, and her heart is protected by unwavering boundaries of self-respect. She is the living example that reconstruction is possible, and that the final phase of pain is always an awakening to a higher light. The woman who has reached the final stage of Jungian consciousness masters the alchemy of silence, using it as a tool for protection and for interpreting reality. While the world gets lost in unnecessary justifications and noise, she observes with a calmness that disarms any attempt at pressure or subtle emotional manipulation. Jung believed that silence is the womb of self-knowledge, and this woman inhabits this space with a confidence that communicates a clear message of sovereignty. She no longer feels the urgent need to explain herself or convince others of the validity of her choices and paths. Her silent strength is a natural barrier against those who seek only to extract energy without offering any reciprocity or genuine respect for her essence. Her silence is not empty. It is filled with a presence that demands that the other also look honestly within themselves. This ability to observe without reacting impulsively is what makes her so unpredictable and intimidating to minds focused on control and predicting others. She has learned to process her emotions internally, transforming the lead of stress into the gold of mental clarity and personal and spiritual strategy. To the external observer, she always seems to be one step ahead, as she doesn't let herself be carried away by emotional triggers that often trap people in cycles of reaction and regret. She understands that the true answer often lies not in words, but in the boundary she establishes through her behavior and strategic withdrawal. The reconstruction of her identity has allowed her to create a shield of peace that the arrows of others' criticism can no longer penetrate or wound. This stage of maturity is the result of many internal shifts and the conscious decision to no longer be a puppet of social or family expectations. In the silence, she also finds the voice of her intuition, which Jung called a superior psychological function capable of seeing what the common senses ignore. She trusts what she feels and perceives beyond words, which makes her immune to empty promises and theatrics of emotionally immature people. If something doesn't resonate with her truth, she simply withdraws, without fanfare, and without the need to create a stage for her cycle's closure. This detachment from drama is one of the hallmarks of the dangerous woman, for she knows that her vitality should not be wasted on battles that do not belong to her. Her observation is profound, capturing the patterns of behavior that reveal the shadow of the other long before any wound is opened. She protects her emotional territory with the vigilance of someone who knows the sacred value of her own peace and her continuous awakening. Often, the pressure for her to be agreeable or too understanding is used as a tool to make her manipulable and silent about her own needs. However, she has already understood that being understanding of disrespect is a form of self-denial that she is no longer willing to practice in her life. The woman who has reached this final stage knows how to differentiate healthy empathy from toxic tolerance that only serves to maintain control over her actions. She is not afraid of being called selfish for putting her self-respect first, because she understands that she can only offer light if her own lamp is protected. This clarity generates an aura of dignity that naturally repels those who seek only a source of supply for their own inflated ego or deep neediness. The alchemy of her silence is the transmutation of vulnerability into a strength that needs no weapons, only truth. For Jung, the woman who integrates her instinctive wisdom with her intellectual clarity becomes a complete human being, dangerously aware of her own inner divinity. She no longer seeks power over others, but power over her own responses to the onslaughts of the world and the pressures of society. Her attentive observation allows her to navigate stormy seas with a compass that never fails, for she is anchored in herself. She understands that silence is a form of self-respect and a clear boundary imposed on those who do not deserve to hear her voice or share her secrets. This stage is the blossoming of a consciousness that accepts nothing less than radical authenticity and mutual respect in all its interactions. The dangerous woman is, therefore, the guardian of her own soul, a queen who governs with the wisdom that silence and attentive observation have provided her over the years. One of the most profound processes in Jungian psychology is the integration of the shadow, and it is here that the woman labeled as dangerous finds her true power of transformation. She has stopped fighting against her own aspects considered negative by society and has begun to use them as sources of energy and personal protection. By accepting her anger, her ambition, and her ability to say no, she removes the mask of the good girl that made her easy prey for others' control. This fall of masks reveals a solid identity, one that doesn't need to perform perfection to be worthy of love and deep self-respect. The integration of the shadow allows her to use her aggression in a healthy way, establishing boundaries that no one dares to cross without clear consequences. She is no longer fragmented, she is whole, and this wholeness is what generates fear in those who live by social manipulation and lies. By recognizing her own shadow, she also becomes capable of seeing the shadows of others with a precision that borders on the supernatural to the inattentive eye. She is no longer seduced by displays of excessive kindness, for she knows that where there is much artificial light, there is a dense shadow being hidden with effort and falsehood. This clarity protects her heart from new emotional impacts, allowing her to choose her connections based on integrity and not on the need to fill voids. The dangerous woman does not fear the darkness of others because she has already walked through her own valleys and emerged with the light of awareness. The awakening of this profound vision ends the cycle of being deceived by promises that were never intended to be fulfilled by the other party. She now walks with the confidence of one who knows the human landscape in all its colors, from the brightest to the darkest. The shedding of social masks is a painful but necessary process for the rebirth of a soul that desires to be truly free and autonomous in its choices. She understood that maintaining a facade to please others was a form of psychic self-mutilation that drained her vitality and clarity of purpose in the world. By allowing herself to be seen in her vulnerability and strength, she attracts only those capable of handling the reality of a complete human being. This selectivity is interpreted by many as a sign of danger, as it cannot be molded according to the desires or convenience of manipulative third parties. For Jung, this is true individuation, the courage to be who one is, regardless of the pressure to conform to an expected behavioral pattern. She has become non-negotiable in her essence, and this is the basis of her ultimate emotional and spiritual sovereignty. The integration of the shadow brings with it a radical honesty that no longer accepts the small lies and omissions that sustain draining and toxic relationships. She speaks her truth with an elegance that doesn't seek to hurt, but doesn't relinquish the clarity necessary for her own protection and well-being. This transparency acts as a repellent for emotionally immature people who feel threatened by someone who doesn't participate in their mental games and triangulations. She understands that her peace is the result of a life lived in harmony with her deepest values, even if it means displeasing most around her. The dangerous woman doesn't seek approval, she seeks integrity, and this pursuit places her on a level of consciousness where external control simply can no longer reach her. Her strength lies in accepting her total humanity, with all her lights and all her shadows integrated into one being. Finally, this final stage of integration allows her to use her sensitivity not as a weakness, but as a high-precision radar for truth and falsehood. She has stopped apologizing for feeling too much or for noticing what others try to hide beneath rehearsed smiles and kind words, empty of meaning. This awareness is her greatest treasure, for it was won through a process of reconstruction that required the closing of many cycles and the abandonment of many illusions. She walks in the world like a woman who has awakened from a long sleep, ready to live her final phase with a strength that is silent and unwavering. The label of dangerous is, in fact, an award given by those who failed to tame her soul or silence her healed and free heart. She is proof that Jungian psychology is a map to the total liberation of those who have the courage to look within themselves. The final stage of the so-called dangerous woman is characterized by an absolute protection of her vital energy, treating it as a sacred and limited resource. She has learned, often through toxic experiences, that not everyone deserves access to her time, her thoughts, or her emotional and spiritual intimacy. For Jung, this setting of boundaries is a sign of psychic maturity, where the individual recognizes their own value and no longer places it at the mercy of energy vampires. She no longer feels obligated to carry the emotional burden of others or to save those who refuse to do the work of their own healing. This posture of self-respect is what most frightens manipulators, as they lose the source of nourishment they previously exploited without any resistance or clear limits. How have you been protecting your vital energy from people who only seek to consume your peace and vitality lately? This energetic sovereignty allows her to focus entirely on her transformation process and on building a life that reflects her most authentic and profound desires. She has become selective about the environments she frequents and the dialogues in which she chooses to invest her intellect and emotion in a generous and genuine way. Where before there was a need to be included, now there is pleasure in solitude and in the company of a few who vibrate at the same frequency of consciousness and respect. This change in behavior is felt as a threat by social groups based on mutual dependence and control through guilt or social exclusion. For the dangerous woman, exclusion by immature people is, in fact, a liberation and a seal that her individuation process is on the right track. She understands that her light attracts both those who want to warm it and those who want to extinguish it, and she has learned to discern between the two with mastery. By mastering her energy, she also learns to transmute stress into creativity and the pain of the past into fuel for new beginnings and discoveries on her journey. She no longer allows the impact of a hurtful word or careless behavior to destroy her inner harmony for days or weeks on end. Her consciousness acts as a filter that decides what can or cannot enter her inner sanctuary, keeping peace as her absolute and non-negotiable priority. This stage of maturity is the result of meticulous reconstruction, where each piece of her soul has been put back in place with the glue of self-respect and clarity. She walks with a posture that communicates that she is the sole master of her destiny, and that no one is allowed to destabilize the throne of her consciousness. Her silent strength is the result of having learned to say enough to everything that does not honor her path and her inner light. Often attempts to control this woman come through blame games or accusations that she has become cold or distant after her awakening and healing. However, she recognizes these tactics as the last gasps of systems that are losing control over her soul and heart, now unreachable by manipulation. She is no longer shaken by labels, as she understands that the perception of others is merely a reflection of the limitations and shadows of those who judge without knowing the depth. Her sovereignty is unshakable because it does not depend on external approval, but on internal agreement with the laws of her own self and her spiritual truth. She has discovered that being dangerous to the system is being safe for herself, and this exchange is the basis of her happiness and her lasting rebirth. The energy conservation she practices is what allows her to shine with an intensity that never fades, even in the face of the strongest winds. Jung emphasized that the individual who achieves wholeness becomes a center of gravity for their own life, ceasing to orbit around the needs and desires of others. The woman in this final stage inhabits her own body with a presence that is palpable and respected by all who possess even a modicum of discernment and human consciousness. She is proof that emotional manipulation only works as long as the victim does not know their own power and the extent of their vital and sacred energy. By closing the doors to what is abusive, she opens the windows to inspiration, to deep healing, and to relationships based on true freedom and reciprocity. Her dangerousness is merely the necessary protection so that her light continues to illuminate the world without being consumed by the darkness of others' ignorance. She is the queen of her energy, and her kingdom is a space of clarity, transformation, and unconditional peace. One of the most impressive facets of a woman who has reached the dangerous stage, according to analytical psychology, is her surgical ability to close cycles that no longer serve her purpose. She understands that life is made up of phases and that insisting on chapters that have already ended is a waste of her vitality and clarity of soul. The closure occurs without drama, without the need for major confrontations or exhaustive explanations for those who refuse to hear the truth or change their behavior. She simply withdraws her energy and presence, leaving a void that is felt by those who benefited from her excessive tolerance and long-standing patience. This awakening to the finitude of draining relationships is what allows her to be reborn in new geometries of destiny, much more aligned with her sovereignty and inner peace. For Jung, the ability to say goodbye is fundamental to the individuation process and to the integral health of the human and spiritual psyche. This woman does not fear the emptiness that remains after a breakup, for she has learned to fill her own space with self-respect and activities that nurture her daily growth and awareness. Where others see loneliness or loss, she sees fertile ground, where new seeds of transformation can be planted without the interference of manipulative and toxic weeds. She understands that each person who leaves her life makes room for her own light to shine brighter and for new connections based on self-worth to emerge. This detachment is what makes her dangerous to those who use the fear of abandonment as a tool of control and pressure on the hearts of others. She has proven to herself that she is capable of surviving and flourishing alone, which makes her immune to any threat of isolation from immature systems. Her destiny is now drawn by her own hands and guided by the compass of her healed and vigilant intuition. For this woman, closing a cycle is a sacred act of fidelity to herself, a decision to no longer accept crumbs of affection or respect in exchange for her peace. She recognizes the patterns of emotional manipulation and decides she will no longer be a pawn on the chessboard of those who selfishly play with the feelings and vulnerabilities of others. By withdrawing, she breaks the cycle of abuse and forces the other person to confront their own shadows, no longer having anyone to project their internal flaws and frustrations onto. This turning point is what generates the label of dangerous, because she cannot be convinced to return to a dynamic she has already identified as harmful and limiting to her soul. She walks with the elegance of someone who knows the exact moment to close the door and the invaluable ability to never look back with regret. Her reconstruction requires her to be the guardian of her own story and the judge of what deserves her attention. Often a woman who decisively ends cycles is the target of gaslighting attempts or distortions of the truth by those left behind in their immaturity. However, she has developed a psychological immunity to these attacks because her clarity about the facts and about her own pain is now unshakable and crystal clear as a diamond. She doesn't need the other person to admit their mistakes for her to feel validated in her decision to leave and seek new horizons of healing and conscious awakening. Her conscience is the final tribunal where she has found her innocence and her liberation from the shackles of relationships that only sought to diminish her brilliance and vital force. For her, closure is the beginning of a new final phase where freedom is the air she breathes and self-respect is the ground she treads firmly on. She is the mistress of her own endings and the midwife of her own glorious new beginnings. Jung emphasized that the soul seeks wholeness, and wholeness demands that we say goodbye to everything that is partial, false, or that requires the negation of our human and divine essence. The dangerous woman is the one who has heard this call of the soul and had the courage to sacrifice the comfort of illusion for the liberating harshness of the truth of the facts. She understands that destiny is not something that happens to her, but something she co-creates through her conscious choices of permanence or strategic and definitive withdrawal. By mastering the art of closure, she becomes invincible, for nothing can hold her against her will or against her awakened and vigilant awareness of her own peace. She is proof that rebirth is a daily choice, and that the final stage of the conscious woman is full sovereignty over her own journey. Her geometry of destiny is now a straight line towards the light, free from the sinuous curves of the manipulations of the toxic past. When a woman reaches this final stage of awakening, she develops a magnetism born from her radical authenticity and lack of need to please. She no longer performs for a social audience, and this indifference to external approval is what makes her irresistibly attractive to some and deeply intimidating to others. Carl Jung explained that the person who becomes themselves emanates an energy that organizes the environment around them, forcing truth to emerge and falsehood to retreat. This magnetism is not sought. It is a natural byproduct of a psyche that has rebuilt itself after the impact of stressful experiences and patterns of control. She now attracts connections based on clarity and respect, instantly repelling anyone seeking only a mask or a role for her to play. What are the aspects of your authenticity that most alienate people who can't stand the truth about who you've become today? Her authenticity is radical because she doesn't hide her scars, but uses them as medals of wisdom and signs of a war won against self-denial and fear. She speaks what she feels and thinks with a transparency that removes any shadow play or secrets that often fuel toxic and manipulative relationships in everyday life. This posture clears the emotional field around her, allowing only what is real and authentic to remain in her intimate circle of deep connection and exchange. The dangerous woman is not afraid of being misinterpreted because she understands that the interpretation of others is their problem and not a definition of who she is in her essence. For Jung, this is the culmination of individuation, the human being who does not need psychological crutches or masks to walk in the world with integrity and silent strength. She is proof that the truth liberates not only the one who speaks it, but the entire environment around the one who lives it fully. This magnetism acts as a natural filter, ensuring that only those who have also done the work of their own healing and awakening can remain in its vital and sacred orbit. It no longer accepts crumbs of attention or affection, as its own inner source of self-worth is abundant and overflowing at all times on its spiritual journey. Where before there was a desire to save or be saved, now there is a will to share life with those who are also sovereign of their own soul and destiny. This paradigm shift is what generates the label of dangerous, because it cannot be manipulated through its old needs, which have now been fully met by consciousness. It walks with a presence that communicates that it is self-sufficient, which is the greatest nightmare for those who live by creating emotional dependencies on others. Its strength lies in its fullness, and its beauty is the reflection of a heart that owes nothing to anyone and belongs completely to itself. Radical authenticity also manifests in her ability to forgive herself for having allowed her energy to be drained in the past by patterns of control and lack of empathy from others. She understands that each step was necessary for her maturation and no longer wastes time on regrets that would only drain her current vitality and clarity in the modern world. This self-forgiveness is what gives her the firmness to establish non-negotiable boundaries now, because she knows exactly the price she paid for not having done so earlier on her journey. She protects her new life with the vigilance of a lioness, ensuring that the sacred ground of her peace is never again profaned by emotional manipulations of any kind. Her magnetism is the light of someone who has found her own compass and who is not afraid to follow the direction herself points, even against the wind. The dangerous woman is, above all, a woman free from the need to be understood by those who have no eyes for the truth of the soul. Finally, this final stage of authenticity allows her to live her life with a spontaneity that is the hallmark of deep healing and the true awakening of human consciousness. She doesn't calculate every step to avoid judgment, but flows with life, trusting that her inner structure is solid enough to handle any challenge or change of course. Her dangerousness is the threat she poses to systemic falsehood, as she cannot be integrated into games of appearances or power dynamics based on lies. She is the sovereign of her own story, and her magnetism is a silent invitation for others to also have the courage to break their chains and awaken to their own light. The stage of the dangerous woman is the blossoming of a consciousness that has decided that the only life worth living is an authentic life grounded in self-respect. She is the living example that reconstruction is the path to a glory that time cannot erase, nor the judgment of others diminish. Jung frequently used paradoxical symbols to describe the totality of the human psyche, and the woman in the final stage of dangerous consciousness personifies the union between cunning and serenity. She possesses the wisdom of the serpent, capable of crawling through the shadows and identifying the hidden dangers in the soil of human relationships and invisible patterns of control. Nothing escapes her radar of discernment, for she has learned to observe the subtle signs that reveal a lack of empathy and manipulation before damage is done to her peace. At the same time, she maintains the gentleness of the dove, an inner calm that is not disturbed by cheap provocations or attempts to emotionally destabilize others. This balance between vigilance and peace is what makes her unreachable for the onslaught of emotionally immature people who seek only conflict and chaos. She knows when to withdraw and when to act, driven by an intuition that is now her most faithful and wise advisor at all times on her journey. This wisdom allows her to navigate complex environments without being contaminated by the surrounding toxicity, maintaining her psychic and spiritual integrity in any circumstance of life or work. She understands that true strength lies not in attacking, but in possessing such a solid internal structure that no external attack can find a foothold to wound her soul. Her gentleness is not passivity, it is a conscious choice not to empower those who seek only the reaction and energy of her pain or momentary indignation. For Jung, this is the mark of someone who has integrated their aggressive shadow and transformed it into a shield of discernment and a silent force that commands natural and profound respect. The dangerous woman is one who knows her own capacity for fierceness, but chooses peace because her soul now inhabits a level where unnecessary conflict is seen as a waste of precious time. The awakening of this awareness is what guarantees her sovereignty over her own days and nights of rest and healing. By uniting these opposites within herself, she becomes a master in the art of closing cycles and protecting her vital energy from boundary intrusions by manipulative third parties. She identifies emotional manipulation at its root and cuts it with the blade of truth, without needing drama or major confrontations that would only drain her vitality and mental clarity. Her presence communicates that she knows who is before her, which makes liars feel uncomfortable and authentic people feel safe and validated in their own quest. This magnetism of someone who knows light and shadow in an integrated way is what generates the label of dangerous in circles where falsehood is the common currency. She is the guardian of her own truth and does not allow anyone to draw the map of her life or dictate the rules of her maturation and happiness. The reconstruction of her soul has allowed her to create a harmony that is both gentle and unbreakable in the face of the challenges and pressures of the modern world. Her sovereignty over her own energy is the result of having learned to value her peace above any need to be accepted or to belong to groups that demand the sacrifice of her sacred essence. She understands that her vitality is the fuel for her purpose and does not allow it to be wasted on draining relationships or dialogues that do not lead to awakening and human evolution. The wisdom she carries is the fruit of a maturation process that did not skip steps and that faced pain head-on to transform it into a resilient and silent force. She no longer seeks to convince anyone of her truth, for she knows that truth is sovereign and reveals itself in due time to those who have eyes to see and hear. The gentleness of her heart is the reflection of a soul that has found its center and no longer needs to fight to prove its own worth in the court of others' opinions. The dangerous woman is the woman who has forgiven herself and who now walks with the lightness of one who knows that the universe conspires in favor of her integrity and her light. Finally, this final stage of consciousness allows her to live her final phase with a fullness rarely achieved by those still trapped in social masks and roles of excessive and false agreeableness. She is the architect of her destiny, using wisdom and gentleness to co-create a reality where truth, healing, and transformation are the cornerstones of her inner and outer kingdom. Her danger lies in her absolute freedom, as there are no emotional hooks or manipulations that can bind her again to the darkness of unconsciousness or paralyzing fear. She is proof that Jungian psychology is a path to inner divinity, where the human being becomes a channel for light through the integration of all their parts. This woman's maturation is the gift she gives to the world, showing that it is possible to be reborn from the ashes of abuse and become a phoenix of consciousness and silent power. She is sovereign, she is real, and her journey is an invitation for all women to awaken to their own unwavering and divine strength. The final phase of the so-called dangerous woman is ultimately the definitive victory of consciousness over trauma and over the patterns of control that attempted to imprison her human and spiritual essence. She is no longer defined by what happened to her, but by how she chose to process and integrate these experiences into her narrative of silent strength and total reconstruction. Jung explained that healing happens when we stop fighting the past and begin to use its lessons to illuminate the present with clarity and profound, non-negotiable self-respect. This woman transformed the lead of her pain into the gold of her emotional sovereignty, and this alchemy is what makes her unreachable for further attempts at manipulation and lack of empathy from others. The awakening of her consciousness ended the cycle of repeating exhausting experiences, allowing her to breathe the pure air of freedom and autonomy over her own steps and choices. If you feel that your conscience has finally won the battle against the shadows of the past and is ready for a life of peace, subscribe to the channel to celebrate this liberation. Her victory is silent, manifested in the absence of a need for revenge or to prove anything to those who once hurt her or unjustly and cruelly pressured her heart. She understands that the best response to abuse and emotional manipulation is a life well lived, grounded in truth and peace that no one else can take from her soul. This indifference towards her former detractors is the final mark of her healing, for it demonstrates that they no longer possess any power or hold over her emotions and inner reactions. She now sees them with wise distance, recognizing their emotional immaturity without being affected by the impact of their shadows, or now ineffective control tactics. For Jung, this is true overcoming, the moment when the individual becomes so complete within themselves that external evil no longer finds an open door to enter and destabilize their throne. She is the phoenix that has risen from the ashes of her own pain, now flying in skies of clarity and unwavering moral and spiritual authority. The woman who has reached this final stage of emotional reconstruction is the guardian of her own light and does not allow the shadows of the world to extinguish her brilliance or diminish her sacred vitality. She has learned to honor her journey and respect the time necessary for each wound to transform into a source of wisdom and silent power for her future path. Her conscience is now her most faithful guide, allowing her to make decisions based on her non-negotiable values and not on the fear of judgment or the need for empty social approval. This freedom of choice is what makes her dangerous to systems based on obedience and the silencing of feminine voices that dare to awaken to their own inner divinity and strength. She is the sovereign of her own story, writing each new chapter with the inks of truth, healing, and the permanent transformation of her earthly existence. The definitive closure of the cycle of pain has allowed her to embrace her final phase with a joy that is profound and unconditional, regardless of external circumstances or the challenges of the modern world. Her presence now is an invitation for other women to also do the work of looking inward and integrating their shadows to find their own sovereignty and silent, unwavering strength. She understands that her healing is not only for herself, but a light that helps dispel the darkness of manipulation and disrespect throughout the collective field of human and feminine consciousness. The dangerousness attributed to her is, in fact, the light of truth that shines so intensely that it exposes the lies and hypocrisies of those who still live in the shadows of ego and control. She walks with the gentleness of one who knows who she is, and with the wisdom of one who knows the paths of the soul and the dangers of self-denial for the sake of others. Her victory is the peace she feels upon waking and upon going to bed, knowing that her heart is in harmony with the laws of the universe and with the will of her own Jungian self. She is whole, she is real, and her journey is a testament to the fact that self-respect is the key to ultimate liberation from any pattern of oppression or control.